The lesson this morning is taken from the book of John, chapter 20, verses 24 to 31. But Thomas, who was called the twin, one of the 12, was not with them when Jesus came, and so the other disciples told him, "We have seen the Lord." But he said to them, "Unless I see the mark of the nails in his hands and put my finger in the mark of the nails and my hand in his side, I will not believe." A week later, his disciples were again in the house, and Thomas was with them. Although the doors were shut, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." And then he said to Thomas, "Put your finger here and see my hands, and reach out your hand and put it in my side, and do not doubt, but believe." And Thomas answered, "My Lord and my God." And Jesus said to him, "Have you believed because you have seen me? Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have come to believe." And now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book. But these are written so that you may come to believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that through believing you may have life in his name. May God bless this reading to our souls.
I believe. Help thou mine unbelief. The words of a desperate father coming to Jesus for help. You remember the story. Jesus had just been to the mountaintop where he had met Moses and Elijah. God's voice came from a cloud saying, "This is my own dear son, listen to him." The transfiguration. The moment when God assured Jesus that his choice to go to Jerusalem was right. Talk about a mountaintop experience. But immediately after that, Jesus had to come down the mountain. And he was confronted with this father, pleading with him to help his epileptic son. Jesus responds, "You can help your son. Everything is possible for the person who has faith." Then came the father's desperate plea. "I do have faith, but not enough. Please, Jesus, help me have more." If we're honest, isn't that our plea as well? Lord, I believe. Help me to have more. Just in case you're not familiar with the story, I need to tell you that Jesus did help him have more and did heal the son. But isn't that our prayer? Lord, I believe. Help me to have more faith. Faith is sometimes difficult. It's difficult because it requires us to believe in things that we cannot see, that we cannot hold, that we cannot hear, that we cannot smell, that we cannot taste. Faith requires us to sense that there are realities that we cannot perceive by our senses. There's a wonderful story that comes out of the 19th century. It happened on a train. Now, some of you know that that's enough to make it a great story. For me, I love trains, but I digress. An elderly gentleman was traveling alone on a train in France, and a much younger man sitting next to him watched the older man take out his Bible and begin to read. And after a while, the younger man decided to strike up a conversation, and he asked, "What are you reading?" And the older man replied, "I'm reading from the 6th chapter of the Gospel of John in the New Testament." "What does it say?" the younger man asked. "Oh, it's the story of the miracle of the loaves and the fishes. John tells us how about Jesus preached to a vast crowd until it was dark and they were hungry, and with only 5 barley loaves and a couple of dried fish, Jesus fed the entire crowd of 5,000. And the leftovers overfilled 12 baskets." "Surely you don't believe that," replied the young man. "Oh, but I do," said the older man. "Oh, well, not me. That could never happen to me because I'm a scientist and the only thing I trust and believe in is what can be proven scientifically. That silly story defies the laws of science. It's nonsense. No, give me facts, provable facts." And then rather condescendingly, he continued, "Of course, I wouldn't expect you to understand that." When the train arrived at the next station, the young man got up to leave, saying, "It was nice talking to you, Mr. Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't get your name." With that, the older man reached into his pocket, pulled out his business card, and he handed it to the younger man. The name on the card was Louis Pasteur. Louis Pasteur, one of the greatest scientists of the age. But he knew that the scientific method, as valuable as it is, and it is not the only road to truth. The real truth, says James Moore, is that the best things in life can't be proved in a laboratory. Love, courage, integrity, honesty, morality, perseverance, compassion, kindness, commitment, faith. You can't put those things into a test tube, but we know how incredibly important they are. And we know how dramatically they were proclaimed in the life and death and resurrection of our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. You know, as I was thinking about that story, I was wondering what the young man would have done if Pasteur had been reading about the resurrection. Somebody rising from the dead. Surely for a mind like his, it would have been easier to believe that Jesus fed 5,000 people with 5 loaves and 2 fishes. Moore is right. The best things in life cannot be proved in a laboratory. No wonder Paul says that the message of the cross is sheer folly to those who cannot or will not believe. He says Jews demand signs and Greeks look for wisdom, but we proclaim Christ crucified. And though this is an offense to Jews and folly to Gentiles, yet to those who are called, Jews and Gentiles alike, he is the power of God. Jesus is the wisdom of God. Another thought. Honest doubt is a necessary way station on the road to a deep and abiding faith. Can it really be true, this gospel we say we believe? And yet, to ask the question seems heretical, especially in a place like this. Sometimes we think we shouldn't even ask the question. Sometimes we feel guilty if we do, thinking that a true disciple would have no doubts at all. Therefore, if we doubt, we must not be disciples. But listen to these words. They're near the very end of Matthew's gospel. Matthew says, "The 11 disciples made their way to Galilee, to the mountain where Jesus had told them to meet him. And when they saw him, they knelt in worship, though some doubted." Some were doubtful. Some of the very closest of Jesus' companions throughout his ministry, some of them doubted. Well, of course they did. The dead did not rise from the dead. We all know that. Have you ever seen someone rise from the dead? I haven't. And that is why Jesus, in his post-resurrection appearances, took such great pains to prove that he was alive. Reading through the last chapters of the Gospels recently, I found 9 different stories of Jesus appearing to his disciples and friends after his crucifixion and resurrection. The number's a little subjective, but you can make a good case for it, saying that there were 9 appearances after Jesus' resurrection. And that leads to a question. Why? Why did Jesus appear to those he came to after the resurrection? What was he doing? What were his reasons? Surely one of his reasons was to prove that he was alive. Of course, his most famous appearance was to Thomas, that story that Joe read for us just now. John's Gospel says that Jesus appeared to the other disciples on Easter Sunday night, but Thomas wasn't there. Where he was, the text doesn't say. Barclay suggests that he had been so overcome with grief that he simply had to be alone and he retreated into himself. That's a possibility, but there's nothing in the text to say so. And in the end, it really doesn't matter why he wasn't there. He just wasn't there. And of course, when Jesus did appear to the others, they couldn't wait to share the good news with Thomas. And Thomas, well, Thomas acted like Thomas. Thomas was a realist, you see. He had seen Jesus die, and he knew, like we all knew, that when you're dead, you're dead. And so when Thomas heard the great and glorious news, he said, in a pig's oven, or words to that effect. And then he said, okay, but unless I see the scars of the nails in his hands and put my finger on those scars and my hand in his side, I will not believe. And of course, you know what happens next. The next Sunday night, the Sunday following Easter Sunday, Jesus appeared to the disciples again. This time Thomas was with them. And Jesus said, Thomas, put your finger here and look at my hands. And then reach out your hand and put it in my side. Oh, stop your doubting and believe. Now, interestingly, and despite the occasional old Hollywood film that shows Thomas doing it, the text does not say that Thomas took Jesus up on his offer. But it does give us his words of response. Seeing Jesus before him in the flesh, Thomas exclaimed, my Lord and my God. 2,000 years of church tradition has tended to look down its nose at Thomas, saying, why didn't you believe? A real Christian would have believed without question. How come you didn't? The questions are silly questions, and those who ask them show their shallowness. Believing that someone you saw die is now alive is hard for anybody, but believing that someone you saw tortured to death 3 days ago and believing that they could now appear in perfect health 3 days later is simply silly. The Bible knows it. If only we would pay attention when we read the Bible. Think about Thomas again. What did he say when he first heard the news? Unless I see the scars of the nails in his hands, unless I put his hand in his side, I will not believe. And what did Jesus say to Thomas that day when he did appear to him? Thomas, do it. Put your fingers here. Put your hand in my side. But you see, that's nothing new. When Jesus first appeared to the other disciples, guess what he did then? He showed them his hands and his side. The disciples were filled with joy at seeing the Lord. Now, why do you suppose he did that? Why? If not because he knew that they had to see the proof in order to believe. It wasn't just Thomas. And consider what Jesus does in Luke's account of his first appearance to the disciples. Luke says, Jesus himself stood among them and said to them, peace be among you, and they were terrified, thinking they were seeing a ghost. But then he said to them, why are you afraid? Look at my hands and my feet, and see that it is me. Feel me, and you will know, because a ghost doesn't have flesh and bones. So why do we single out Thomas as the disciple so lacking in faith? When we do that, we do a great disservice to him. It's clear that all of the disciples had a hard time believing that the one they had seen die on the cross would now be alive. George Buttrick writes these beautiful lines. He says, everybody doubts. Skeptic and believer, pulpit and pew, that's a prime fact. In some eras, doubt seems to have been the exception and faith the rule. In other eras, faith is the exception and doubt is the rule, but everybody doubts. To every preacher or peddler reading this page, have you not doubted the times of the day? But we may turn the table. Everybody also believes. Even David Hume, harbinger of an age of doubt, once declared that he sometimes wished he had never doubted. There's the sassy story of an atheist who, when asked if he were a Christian, replied angrily, no, I'm an atheist, thank God. So everybody doubts. Skeptic and believer. And everybody believes. We can rightly ask and speak of the faith-doubt tension that exists in all of us. Remember what Tennyson wrote one time? He said, there lives more faith in honest doubt, believe me, than in half the creeds. There's more real faith in the one who insists on being sure than in the one who glibly repeats things which he or she never thought out, in which he or she does not really believe anything. It is honest, thoughtful doubt that in the end arrives at certainty. Oh, Jesus knew that faith would be difficult. So a primary purpose of his appearance after the resurrection was to minister to those doubts. The third thought, when Thomas became convinced of his faith, he committed himself completely to it. My Lord and my God, he said. There is something very lovable and admirable about Thomas. Faith was never an easy thing for Thomas, and obedience never really came to him, and he was the man who had to be sure. Once he was sure, and once he had counted the cost, Thomas was the man who went to the ultimate limit of faith and obedience. Faith like Thomas's faith is better than any glib profession. And an obedience like Thomas's obedience is better than an easy agreement, which says it'll do a thing without counting the cost, and then which goes back on its word. Finally, attaining deep faith simply takes time. So if you're working on the problem, and I hope you are, give it time. A deep and abiding faith is not something that we achieve in a moment or in a day. Deep and abiding faith is something that will require the journey of a lifetime. Like any long journey, some parts of the trip will seem effortless. Others will demand all the effort we can muster. Jesus understood that when he said to Thomas, have you believed because you have seen me? Blessed are those who have not seen and yet believe. You know, we talk often about Scripture speaking not only in its own time, but to us. Here is a verse that I am sure Jesus intentionally was speaking to you in this place and this time and to me. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet believe. Jesus is speaking to us. So if your faith seems to move in fits and starts, don't be surprised, but understand faith will grow if you let it. Faith can be more tomorrow than it is today. As we journey through our lives, our faith can grow. It can grow. Because even though there is no scientific proof of the spiritual realm, there are signs of it. There are signs of the spiritual realm for those who will see them. Some years ago, I was in the hospital for a minor surgery. I had been prepped. I was ready. The only thing left was the surgeon's final visit. And then he came and he said, "Skip, I've decided not to do the surgery today." "Why?" I asked, exasperated. "Well, we found a slight irregularity in your EKG." "Slight?" I said. "Slight? Let's do it anyway." "Oh no," came the reply. "I don't want to be in the middle of the surgery and have you looking down at me from the ceiling." "Oh," I said. I read recently of a young woman who was looking down from the ceiling. She was admitted to the hospital with a serious illness. She believes she died. She remembers being out of her body and watching all of the medical team trying to revive her. And she might suspect it was her imagination. But she also remembers going down the hall of the hospital while all of this was happening and seeing her stepdad going to a vending machine and buying a candy bar. And when she recovered and told her story, her stepdad was amazed because no one had seen him do that. And he hadn't told anyone. The woman couldn't have known unless she had been there to see it. I have a dear friend at the Macedonia church that I served before coming here 20 years ago. He had a massive heart attack. He remembers dying. He remembers seeing a great light. He remembers being transported to what seemed to be heaven. He said, "Skip, it was so beautiful. I'll never be afraid of dying anymore." These experiences of another world, a spiritual world, if you will, they've been reported through the ages in one way or another. Some of you who are dyed-in-the-wool Methodists will remember Jeffrey. Jeffrey was the ghost in the Epworth parsonage where John Wesley was raised. And the Epworth parsonage, its haunting is one of the best-known English poltergeist claims and has been described by author Mary Beth Crane as the second-best authenticated ghost story in history. Anyway, from December 1716 until January 1717, the parsonage is said to have been plagued by a series of regularly occurring mysterious loud noises and knockings. Apparently they were caused by a ghost that the eldest Wesley daughter nicknamed Jeffrey, who made his presence known to all on Christmas Day of 1716. In Susanna Wesley's words, Susanna, of course, was John Wesley's mother. In Susanna's words, "There was such a noise in the room over our heads as if several people were walking and then running up and down stairs that we thought the children would be terrified." And then, according to the tale, she and her husband Samuel searched the house in vain for the culprit. Old Jeffrey continued rattling and thundering in every room and even blowing an invisible horn at deafening decibels. Old Jeffrey supposedly disappeared in January 1717 just as suddenly as he had appeared. There is a sidebar to the story. Apparently, as Jeffrey was doing his thing day after day, Susanna became annoyed and she finally shouted out to him, "Stop the noise during 5 in the morning and 6 in the morning. That is my quiet time." And Jeffrey did. Now, I'm not sure if that says anything about Jeffrey, but I'm sure it says something about Susanna's strong personality and presence. Well, what of all of these stories? Are they proof positive of a spiritual realm? Of course not. And yet, let me ask you, have you never experienced a mysterious, unexplainable moment when the spiritual world seemed to be reaching into your material world? Has that never, ever happened to you? Well, never mind. If the signs we see daily are less spectacular than those of the Wesleys or those of my friend or those of the young woman I just mentioned, the signs that we do see daily are no less sure. We see the glory of a sunrise, the miracle of a crocus awakening in the midst of snow, new life from a mother's womb, the intricacies of a snowflake in an April snow. the endless reaches of the galaxies. We experience the divine presence in an act of kindness or an act of love from one human being to another. And then we know there is more to this world than our poor human senses can behold. The good news of Easter is that God through Christ is with us. May your faith grow as you journey through the life that God has given you.